I do not want to imagine that they're going to live in a worse world than I do, that they won't have the things that we took for granted, particularly in Canada.
Well, that's too late, Trudeau.
There was a lot in that statement.
Welcome back to Northern Perspective, everyone. I'm Cypher.
And I'm Fox. Trudeau has been making his rounds on the podcast circuit, appearing on the Big Story podcast during his trip to Alliston, Ontario this past Thursday to discuss Liberal environmental policies and how well he's doing, or not doing, to meet those targets.
Let's take a look.
Why don't we start with the big picture on electric vehicles, because that's what we're going to talk about mostly today. I want to talk about climate a little as well. And so combining those two things, where do electric vehicles and announcements like this today fit into the big picture of our fight against climate change?
Well, the big picture is actually bigger than just the fight against climate change. It's the big picture of where we're going as a country, and how are Canadians going to thrive in a very, very different world over the coming decades. And that's something that we've all been thinking about for a long time. And for me, the opportunity to highlight that Canada is and should be seen as one of those places that if you're buying something that was made in Canada or created in Canada or invented in Canada or whatever, anywhere in the world, you should be able to say, okay, if there's a maple leaf on it, if it was made in Canada, I know that it was done well, that it paid well the workers, it's environmentally responsible, it's probably done in partnership with Indigenous peoples, or at least in respect. Like, that's a brand that as people around the world, customers and consumers around the world are looking at, okay, I want to be reliable in what I'm buying, I want to be thoughtful about what I'm doing. People should feel that if you're buying something in Canada, that's a niche we should own, that is a good brand that people are comfortable, like buying Italian shoes or Japanese electronics. Whatever you buy from Canada, it should be, okay, this is going to be good quality.
So the interesting thing is Trudeau is talking about electric vehicles. Well, he's missed the boat, because auto manufacturers are actually now not looking to manufacture solely electric vehicles anymore. Why? Because people aren't buying them because they're so expensive. And automakers are having huge problems with the batteries and the amount of recalls and the amount it's costing them. It's not worth it. And you're in an economy where people don't have any money because of AKA Trudeau. So they're not going out and spending $50, $60, $70, $80, $90,000 on these vehicles. And don't take my word for it, and don't take Canadian mainstream media's word for it. Take American mainstream media's word for it. EV euphoria is dead. This is from CNBC. Automakers are scaling back or delaying their electric vehicle plans. So just a quick look here. For years, the automotive industry has been in a state of that's electric vehicle euphoria. Automakers trotted out optimistic sales forecasts for electric models and announced ambitious targets for EV growth. Wall Street boosted valuations for legacy automakers and startup entrants alike, based on part on their visions for an EV future. Now the hype is dwindling, and companies are again cheering consumer choice. Automakers from Ford Motor, General Motors, Mercedes-Benz, Volkswagen, Jaguar, Land Rover, Aston Martin are scaling back or delaying their electric vehicle plans. Even U.S. EV leader Tesla, which is estimated to have accounted for 55% of all EV sales in the country in 2023, is bracing for what, quote, may be notably lower, end quote, rate of growth, CEO Elon Musk said in late January. So it's not going to happen, especially in Canada. Hello, we don't have the infrastructure across this country, especially in rural areas, to have electric vehicles.
Well, it's not going to happen by consumer choice. That's why the government of Canada has a policy in place so that 100% of vehicles are zero emission by 2035, or I should say 100% of vehicle sales are for zero emission vehicles by 2035. So Consumers aren't really choosing electric vehicles, but don't worry, the Liberal government's going to make you have to choose one.
Well, and that's for all new light-duty vehicles, right? So guess what's going to happen?
People are going to start buying not light-duty vehicles.
Or they're going to be, really resuscitating used cars. And you're going to see a huge boost in the used car market because people can't afford them. And if the automakers aren't manufacturing them, where are you going to get them from, Trudeau?
In terms of the climate, when you took over in 2015, climate was a big part of your campaign. At the time, I think I'm speaking for the way a lot of people feel, is climate was definitely a concern. We knew global warming was real. We knew it was going to hit us. Over the past 8 years, it seems to have hit us faster and at a scale that we probably couldn't have imagined back in 2015. How has your own thinking on climate evolved from how you saw it as a candidate and when you first got in office to what you see now, where you probably see some pretty awful reports frequently?
Well, fighting climate change was one of the things that brought me into politics. I watched what the Harper Conservatives were doing or not doing on environment, and that was one of the things that contributed to me wanting to actually step into politics, which is something that for a number of reasons I'd chosen to stay away for or say no to all through my young life. So I came in knowing very much how dire it was, how much the challenges were that we had to face. What I don't think I gave proper weight to until I was actually really thinking about the public policy angles of it and what Canada could do was the opportunity that comes with the terrible reality of climate change.
Okay, so I love how Trudeau, just constantly trots out this stuff about the Harper government. And again, it doesn't really matter if you believe climate change exists or not. What we're dealing with right now is that Trudeau is saying that Harper did nothing in his government to reduce carbon emissions. That's what I'm hearing. Is that what you're hearing?
Yeah, that sounds what he's claiming.
All right. So let's take a look at this. So this is Canada's carbon emissions, CO2 emissions, year over year. Notice what happened in the Liberal years with Chrétien, and then in 2006, there was a bit of a spike, and then there was a sudden drop in 2009. If memory serves, that was under the Harper government.
Yes, it was.
And then that was a general trend downward. There were some spikes, but it was a general trend downward, which continued into Trudeau's era, and then it dropped through the floor during COVID, and there was a steep increase in 2022. And again, we seem to be having a lot of problems getting any statistics past 2021, 2022 with this Liberal Trudeau government. It's almost as if they don't want us to see the performance of their government on many topics past these years. I wonder why that could be. But as you've seen, the Conservative government actually brought down CO2 emissions, and it was on a relatively steady downward trend, which is what you want if you're trying to adjust an entire economy. You can't do it in sudden drops because you're going to break everything in the economy. Gee, look what's happening now.
Well, and also in order to get compliance from the people who make up that economy, you need to do things slowly. I mean, that's with any change. Think about if you want to make a dietary change or maybe you want to start exercising. You need to start doing these things slowly and gradually, and eventually you will form better habits, good habits that will carry you to your goal. But if you try to slam dunk yourself into good eating and exercise habits, you're probably not going to keep it up for very long.
That yes, even as we're fighting climate change, the opportunity to be purveying solutions to the world, the opportunities to grow industries, to build businesses, to find economic growth, in the fight against climate change, because people would throw around numbers like trillions of dollars worth of clean tech that is coming down the line. Well, how do we go from a country that has a big chunk of its GDP reliant on the fossil fuel industry? How do we take that advantage we have right now and have had from the past in energy and translate that into actually building those solutions of the future, so that as the world shifts to other types of energy, or certainly very different energy mix, Canada can still be part of it. And it was that sense of the long term that, yes, even as we're seeing the worst wildfire seasons on record, we're seeing horrible impacts of climate change that's going faster than ever before, that sense, for me, that was always the biggest answer. Whenever a conservative or anyone would come up to me and say, yeah, but Canada's only 1% or 2% of emissions, if we stopped everything, the world would still be going to hell in a handbasket. My point is, well, yeah, but if we figure out how to reduce our emissions, then the way we do that will be really valuable to the world, and therefore will contribute to Canada being able to thrive in a very changing world.
Yeah, let's throw all of our citizens into poverty to meet these fantastic climate change goals that we're not even meeting. And somehow that's going to better the rest of the world? It doesn't make sense.
And he keeps talking about the economy. Let's talk about the economy. Growth. He keeps talking about economic growth. Does this look like economic growth to you? You see, there was growth. There was steady growth under the previous conservative government. As soon as it hit 2015, it dropped. And then there was more growth. And then in COVID, it dropped through the floor. Now that's to be expected across the board. Then it rebounded. But here's the thing. Now we're on a steady decline.
It's been on a decline for the last two years. Yeah, 1.5, 2 years.
So all of this money that Trudeau is pouring into the economy, it is now having a net negative effect. And everyone was warning this would happen. Again, when you have strong economic growth, you don't keep pouring money into the economy. You don't run a deficit budget, because that is going to cool the economy. You don't want that. So this just underscores that Trudeau has no idea what he's talking about when he is talking about economic policy. Right? When your economy is struggling, then you run a deficit to
give it a little boost, yeah.
Right? To incentivize it. Think of it as you're pulling the choke on a motor to start the motor up. But then once the motor is going, you pull back.
For example, right after COVID, here in Ontario, Doug Ford had an incentive, I think it was for around a year, that I think they called it the staycation incentive, where you would get a tax break. If you had a staycation somewhere in Ontario, you would get a little bit of money back from your hotel bill or your dining bill, etc. And the purpose of that was to help stimulate the economy in Ontario after COVID, so that the money had to be spent in Ontario by people who were from Ontario.
Yeah, so you kept the money in the Ontario economy, which makes sense. Now, the problem is Trudeau keeps pushing the gas pedal on, and he's flooded the engine. That's what's happened. He has flooded the engine of the economy, and it's stalling. And everyone has been putting out this alarm now for a couple of years. But Trudeau doesn't want to hear it because, the drama teacher knows economics best.
Well, and don't forget, the history major knows our budget best.
Yeah.
Have we capitalized on those opportunities over the last 8 years? And I want to ask you a question that during every election cycle that you've run in and your opponents have run in, I've asked climate experts to grade the climate policies of the various parties. So grade yourself. It's been 8 years. As you mentioned, we just had the worst wildfire season in history. There are opportunities like this announcement, but we've also missed a lot of targets in that time. So how would you grade your government's climate response?
Sorry, Jordan, which targets have we missed?
I think we've missed a couple of Paris Accord targets. Have we not? Are we not on target for that? No,
we haven't.
No, you got me on that.
We're very much on track. No, but it's understandable because we missed Kyoto. We were way from Harper being able to achieve any of his targets. Like, we've had decades of government saying, yes, the environment matters, but when comes time to saying to Canadians, okay, you got to pee in the dark and save 3 cents a night, or you've got to figure out how to reduce your consumption of electricity or reduce your major consumption, people actually haven't been put on the spot of making those changes, because change is hard, and change is sometimes feels more expensive even if you're going to end up saving money in the long term. So we've had successive governments, including Liberal governments, that were very good at creating national parks as political governments.
You've done lots
of
of that.
governments. But are you actually protecting the areas that are outside of the national parks? Are you actually changing the way the economy works? That has always been much, much harder. And that's where our decision to bring in a price on pollution and use it as not just something that is going to be fighting climate change, but using it as a measure of affordability to actually put more money back in people's pockets, but also as an argument to global investors coming in saying, look, we are acting on fighting climate change. There's a steel plant in Hamilton that would have been paying hundreds of millions of dollars in climate change, in a climate tax on a price on pollution by 2030, but they are now going to be shifting to electric arc instead, so they won't be using that kind of coal to fire their furnaces. These are the shifts that not just make sense economically, but they actually make sense in terms of good jobs. So actually being a government that is doing things where we're going to meet our 2030 targets, we're on track to surpass them, we're moving forward in a way that no government has ever seen before. That is a significant difference, and that's significantly better than any other government.
Okay, this is one big, long fact check to everybody, but we're going to keep going here. So again, we're on track to hit our 2030 goal. Really? Really? Well, let's take a look. So this is from the National Observer. Canada on track to miss climate targets again. This is from November of 2023. Canada's Environment Commissioner said it is not clear how the oil and gas sector will achieve the greenhouse gas emission reductions prescribed under the federal government's climate plan, and called for more transparency around the modeling. The article goes on to say, while some industries are heading in the right direction, others, like oil and gas, have made negative progress on reducing planet-warming greenhouse gas emissions, said DeMarco. Oil and gas sector emissions increased 88% from 1990 to 2021, and because it is such a large sector, those increases drown out progress in other sectors like electricity, which saw a 45% reduction over the same period. The government first promised to cap emissions from oil and gas production in 2021 and said details about the form and timeline of the regulations would be communicated in early 2023. In July, Environment Minister Stephen Guilbeault extended the timeline, with draft regulations expected before the end of the year. It goes on to say, Canada won't meet its climate targets at this rate, but forthcoming regulations have the potential to greatly reduce emissions if they are stringent enough, Canada's Environment Commissioner found. The oil and gas emissions cap is currently delayed. So, really, they have their carbon tax. Congratulations.
Well, and it sounds like they're not meeting their projected emissions rates. Like, they have missed things, and it sounds like they'll miss the Paris Accord in 2030 if they keep it up.
Right.
So, I mean, again, they're just putting us all into poverty for no good reason.
Exactly.
I got to point out though that, and I want to talk in a minute about why I thought that way, because I think that's important to the conversation we're having. But
Sure.
you also didn't give yourself a grade, your government
Well,
grade.
I used to be a teacher. I was in the business of giving people grades. As a politician, you get graded by citizens, and that happens in elections. And it doesn't really happen in between, although opinion polls can give you a sense of how people are feeling.
Oh, they sure can. They sure can.
I can't decide if Justin is trying to put on a face like, oh, I'm not worried about the opinion polls, and we'll see what people have to say in the election. I'm not sure if that's just an act, or if he actually believes that the polls are wrong and he can win the next election.
Yeah, because here's your in-between, everybody. And he's been getting a failure grade for about 2 years now.
Well, and that's the thing. He won't grade himself, because he won't say like, oh, well, maybe it's a 7. We're doing pretty good, but, there's always room for improvement. To me, that's a smart answer, because he knows people in the media, people on YouTube like us, are going to lambaste him and be like, you think you're a 7? You're in like the negatives, buddy.
Yeah, it's It's just beyond ridiculous. The cognitive dissonance, the lying, or everything in between at this point.
Well, and he can't give himself a grade too low, or else he's admitting that he's doing a bad job. So this is one of those questions that he knows he can't answer, because no matter how he answers it, it's not going to look good.
Yeah, so I just won't give myself a grade at all.
What happens in terms of grading, that happens in the elections. What I am confident about is the things we have done have significantly bent the curve, both in terms of reducing our emissions faster, or changing the curve of our emissions more than any of other G7 partners. And we're actually seeing more global investment. As you heard earlier at the announcement, last year we were the number 3 country in the world for global foreign direct investment into Canada, after the US and Brazil. We've seen a 60% increase since 2015 in money coming into Canada, because people are seeing that there's exciting things happening in Canada where we're aligned on the 20-25 year horizon that most big investments are looking at.
Why do you think that the average person feels so negative about climate change right now? Obviously, it's a really serious issue. When you speak about it, you speak of opportunities in building for the future and investments like this one. There's a reason that I just kind of assumed that we'd missed some targets, because things seem to keep getting worse. And I wonder how, you as somebody who needs to court Canadians' votes, but also plan for the future, how do you try to push back against that and saying this is a problem and we're dealing with it, but I think a nihilism can creep in, right? Where you're like, everything is going to hell, and it's not worth me recycling or whatever because of it.
And that has been, I think, a core question. When I was studying environmental geography at the graduate level at McGill, that was one of the big questions. Do you go doom and gloom? Do you try and say the planet is burning, we're all in so much trouble if we don't change our behaviors radically, it's the end of the world if we don't change? And nobody tended to change. People have been trying to do that doom and gloom for a long time, and yet Canada and other countries kept missing targets and behaviors not changing enough.
Yeah.
So, listen, you don't. I've been out across the country. I've seen the forest fires. I've seen the floods. I talked to a Saskatchewan mayor years ago who said, look, we can handle a 100-year flood. We just can't handle it every 5 years. Right. And that's the pace of things coming, right? And there's a real ease to sort of sit back and say, well, I'm just going to worry about right now and next year or 10 years from now or the next generation. Well, they're in trouble no matter what we do, so why even bother? And that's where, for me, showing that Canada and Canadians can bend the curve. We can make a difference. We can be bringing forward these solutions. Because, quite frankly, when I look at my kids, I do not want to imagine that they're going to live in a worse world than I do, that they won't have the things that we took for granted, particularly in Canada.
Well, that's too late, Trudeau.
There was a lot in that statement. I mean, he says he doesn't want to go all doom and gloom because it doesn't work and blah, blah, blah. But then goes on to talk about the forest fires and... I mean, that's all these guys do. Doom and gloom. Oh my gosh, look at all these forest fires. It's your guys' fault for not having a good forestries program. 50% of our forest fires are caused by lightning strikes, and they could mitigate that. I mean, you can't stop the lightning, but you could mitigate it by clearing out the underbrush and starting controlled fires and cleaning up the forest and having a good forestries program so that when lightning does strike, it's not as destructive to the people around it.
Well, and I always like that they say, oh, well, forest fires are caused by climate change. Can you please explain that to me? Are you trying to argue that the climate is drying out in Canada? Because we're not seeing that. So what are you... What are you trying to argue here? That it's getting so hot in Canada that forests are just setting on fire? Because no, that's not the case. So what are you actually trying to argue?
Honestly, I don't think they're trying to argue anything. I think they're trying to play boogeyman and say, oh, look, climate change, climate change. That's the problem. When really, it's not. I mean, as I said, if you mitigate some of the damage caused by the lightning strikes by doing things like controlled burns and cleaning out the underbrush in our forests and having a good forestry's management program in this country, then a lot of this damage won't be caused. Stop using climate change as the boogeyman in this case. He says he's trying not to, be all doom and gloom, but that's what they're doing.
And, one of our viewers actually made a good point in a comment. We have a terrible forestry management program, but over half of the country is forest. So maybe that's some justification that we look at improving our forest management.
A country of lakes and forests and beautiful natural spaces that we've always taken for granted. The fact that that might not be there is something that I will not accept. So given that I'm not accepting that the future will be worse, I have to say, okay, well then we've got to do everything we can now to prevent it, because we got to be active on that. And then I look at everything we can do to make sure that as a leader, I'm bringing Canadians along. And it's always hard because, as you say, people are anxious about it. Climate change is getting worse. The impact of climate change is getting worse and will continue to get worse into the coming years. The only way through is to minimize how bad it's going to get 10, 20, 30 years from now by changes we make now. And the changes Canada can make are the things that are not just changing our behaviors, but showing the world and creating technologies and solutions for the world that they can then take on that will change the trajectory. China continues to open, dozens of coal plants every single week. These are huge challenges that the world is going in the wrong direction. They don't necessarily want to be, there's just no other alternative. So if a country like Canada isn't the one that can figure out, listen, we figured out the technology necessary to get oil out of oil sands, which wasn't possible 50 years ago. It was technology that innovated that. A lot of really smart scientists that figured that out. We can be figuring out hydrogen. We can be figuring out small modular reactors. We can be figuring out wind and solar and tidal and whatever else, and more geothermal. Like, we have the knowledge, the land, the resources, the capacity to do it, and we have a government and a series of governments that are willing to lean in to make those investments in the long term. That's what's exciting to me.
Wait a minute. Sounds like he just said nuclear. So what? Your environment minister is against nuclear, but you just advocated for small modular nuclear reactors.
Because nuclear is the way of the future. I think we all know that.
Oh yeah, but apparently Jibo, missed the boat on that. But here's the other thing. Trudeau is actually talking about something we've talked about here, that China is dramatically increasing their pollution. And he's saying, well, it's not that they want to, they have no alternative. Yes, there actually is an alternative. It's LNG. Natural gas.
Which Canada has in spades.
Right, which you've basically tried to shut down. Why are you not talking with China and saying, hey, we'll build you, natural gas plants. We will export a whole bunch of natural gas to you. You don't have to use coal anymore. Shut all that down and we can move that over. And then in the meantime, China, what we'll do is we'll work with you to stand up small nuclear reactors. How about that?
Do we really want to give China nuclear material?
I think they have it anyway. But you see the point. It's like if your goal is to do whatever we can, well, you're not doing it whatever you can. Whatever you can is, well, we want to be a beacon for the world. Like, hello, there's beacons of the world in terms of environmental policy all over the place. You think China cares? They don't. They want to do what's cheap.
Well, and I agree with Trudeau on one thing that he said, that Canadians did invent all this technology, and Canadians can solve the problem using technology that we will invent in the future. But you don't have to put us into poverty in order to accomplish that.
Well, and this is the problem. And all of Trudeau's economic policies is stifling all of it. That's the issue. You are stifling innovation. With this new budget, you're basically saying, don't even bother, startups. Don't even bother. You're not going to be able to get your companies going because we're going to be taxing you out the behind on your capital gains for it. So you won't even be able to give shares away because we're going to tax you on that. So this is the problem. So you need an economy that is free of the government, right? The government is supposed to push it along like a kid on a learning on a bike. And once the kid is off and riding, the government needs to stand back and let it go and not get in the way. What the government can do is get in front of it and make sure that the economy can keep going and can continue incentivizing, but you don't spend to a significant deficit, and you don't throw in all kinds of regulations to suffocate the economy from actually growing. And that's what's happening. But Trudeau, the narcissist, he wants to put his name on everything. Say, well, I did this, and I fixed the economy, and I did... Everything that you touch turns to ash. And that's what Canadians are seeing. And your budget that was targeting young people, it has had the net opposite effect. Young people are leaving you in droves because they have seen what your quote-unquote promises amount to. And that is a less prosperous Canada, a less affordable Canada, and a Canada that Canadians, frankly, don't want to live in anymore. So I don't think the answer, and I don't think Canadians think the answer, is that we need to move out of this country. The answer is that Trudeau needs to move out of office.